This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign for a free sample of the first chapter. That's fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. This is a Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 240. Welcome to the 240th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Welcome to today's show. I always start the episodes by saying how excited I am to share the episodes with you, because when I have a great interview to share and a great episode, if it's for instance, one of my on-air client sessions, I'm always super excited. But today is special. Today, I'm so excited. I'm so excited that I can barely record the episode because I want to jump around and do a dance. And the reason why I'm so excited, as you heard on the introduction, is because today is the day that my very first book came out. It is live, it is published, and it is in the world, and it is a real thing. And I couldn't be happier. And so my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility, has been released today. And that is why also I'm releasing a special episode today. So this is January 21st, 2019, and this is release day. Hooray! So in today's episode, I want to take some time and talk about the book, why I wrote the book, and also what's in the book, so that you have a really good idea about, what it's all about. And on Friday, I'm actually going to release an episode where I share more about behind the scenes. So what transpired, how the writing process was, and all the different steps between having this great idea for a book and having the book actually into the world. For now, I'll just say that I was very humbled by the process of writing this book, because I certainly underestimated the amount of effort that goes into publishing a really good book. And so for those of you who have listened to the podcast for quite some time, you'll have certainly picked up on the book title, The Fifth Vital Sign. Now, I'm not the one that, first came up with the idea that the menstrual cycle is the fifth vital sign. I learned that when I was first learning about fertility awareness charting. And so I've said on the podcast many times that when I first discovered fertility awareness, I was in this looking back, there's really very few places in the world, especially nearly 20 years ago, where fertility awareness was happening and women would have access to it in the way that I had access to it. So I first discovered fertility awareness when I was in university. I was the tender age of 18 or 19. I can't really remember exactly my age, but I was around the age of 18 or 19, because that's when I first became sexually active and needed to have birth control. And that was around the time when I discovered fertility awareness. And so it was around that time, and I discovered it on my university campus, and there just so happened to be a group of women who led charting circles, and it's still there, the Fertility Awareness Charting Circle in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And so this group of women led monthly sessions where we would do a big introduction at one point in the year, and then we would meet, and women could just show up and have their charts interpreted and learn to chart in this really supportive environment. So within that environment, there were women who were certified fertility awareness educators, who were trained women who were training. And it didn't take long before I became part of the group, and I did a training program myself many, many years ago, and I started teaching. I mean, that's a surprise to exactly no one. But it was at that time in my life when not only did I discover charting. So for me, first, it was just like, whoa, I'm not fertile every day. This is amazing. I don't have to be on hormones. I can just figure out when I'm fertile. And that was awesome. It was such a great experience for me, because really I was a young lady. I was in university. I was, barely 20 years old, and I was able to use fertility awareness successfully to avoid pregnancy. And that was something that has then followed me throughout my entire adult life. And initially for me, it was like, okay, great, this is fantastic. I can avoid pregnancy. But it quickly became a lot more because my cycles weren't following the ideal parameters, and my cycles were on the longer side. And I went to my doctor and asked my doctor, hey, can you help me get my cycles normalized? And my doctor was like, well, just go on the pill. That's the only thing you can do. So really, it was at that point that my charting instructor, Geraldine Mattis, had a look at my charts and suggested that I have my thyroid tested. And this really began my journey, because up until that point, I just thought that charting was really cool. And I thought it was a really neat method of birth control. But it was through this group of amazing women that I discovered that the menstrual cycle is actually a vital sign, meaning that I had this really subtle subclinical thyroid disorder where my thyroid was just off a little. But it was off enough to change my charts in such a way that a trained educator could look at them and suggest to me to have that tested. And so that moment in time fundamentally changed how I looked at my menstrual cycle. And it also really just opened my eyes as to the implications and the applications of fertility awareness. And so this was the beginning of this journey that led to the book now imprint, The Fifth Vital Sign. And essentially, the message of the fifth vital sign is that, of course, charting is still really cool, and you can use charting in various very practical ways. You can use the knowledge that you learn about fertility awareness to avoid pregnancy naturally to the effectiveness of 99.4% when used correctly. So when you combine your observations of your cervical mucus and cervical position with your temperature, your basal body temperature, you can really learn to identify which parts of your cycle are fertile, which parts are not, and then use that for birth control. And you can also really optimize when you time sex. And so it's a very practical thing. It's great. But the central message of the book is that it's so much more than that. And it's also a fundamental right of every woman to have the opportunity to learn about her cycle. Because I don't think that every single woman is going to want to use fertility awareness necessarily as her primary birth control, because there's no one birth control that's right for every single woman on planet Earth. All women are different, and we all have different preferences, and we're all at different places in our life as well. So for some women, fertility awareness may be really amazing at some points in their lives, but maybe not others. And so at the end of the day, though, what's the central piece of it that all women deserve to have is the knowledge and the freedom to make that decision for themselves. And so, it's been very consistent, again, since day one. I went back and listened to, I think it was the second episode of the podcast, episode 1, part 2. I think it was the myths and facts of fertility awareness. And it was fascinating for me to listen to this episode, 4 years later, because I realized wow, I've been saying the same thing for almost, for 5 years for 4 years, going on 5 years. I've actually been saying the same thing. And so for those of you who have been listening to this podcast for the long haul, those of you who have been with me for the past, 3 years, 4 years, and also for those of you who have gone back and listened to the back catalog and kind of started at the beginning, you'll recognize that the message has never changed. The message has been very, very consistent since day one. And the concept of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign has been something that I've known for nearly 20 years just because of my interactions. As I mentioned, when I first discovered fertility awareness and I was training among these amazing women with so much more knowledge and experience than me when I first started out in the field, and that message is still the same. And this is something that all women have the right to know. And the book really comes from my desire to share with all women this knowledge. And as I get older, so I'm not old by any stretch of the imagination, but I have been in this particular field for nearly 20 years. And so having discovered this information when I was around 18, 19, and now being 36, I realized that when I look around, yes, a lot has changed. And a lot more noise is happening in the space. A lot more women know about fertility awareness. A lot more copies of Taking Charge of Your Fertility have been sold. And so there's a lot more awareness about it. But on a fundamental policy level, when it comes to the level of education that women are provided in the school system and your average woman's knowledge about her cycles, although there have been significant gains and more people are aware of fertility awareness, where we're at today, it's different to where it was when I first discovered it. Like, I didn't have any charting apps or anything, and there weren't all these devices. So we have definitely made progress, but your average woman still doesn't know how her cycle and her fertility works. And so I don't want to ignore the changes that have happened and the progress that has been made, but at the same time, we're just barely there. We've really barely scratched the surface until every single woman, girl, mother, daughter, sister, cousin, until every single woman and man, for that matter, is aware just of this basic general physiology, how our fertility works, how our menstrual cycle works, how to identify cervical mucus in the cycle, and what is the significance of cervical mucus, and why really girls should be taught about cervical mucus just like they're taught about their periods, because it's just as important, if not more, since it's an indication of ovulation. These very, very basic biological functions in our body, until every woman knows about that, like I'm not done. I'm still going to go. I'm still going to talk about it. And I'm just not going to stop, because ultimately, for what I've heard over the years now, so now when I'm coming to you after being in this seat and podcasting and connecting with this amazing community over the past 4 years, what I hear is still the same. So the message I've been putting out is the same, and what I hear back is the same. So what I hear back is, every woman needs to know this. This information changed my life. This is incredible. I wish I would have known this when I was younger. I get a lot of women in their late 30s and 40s telling me, man, I wish I would have known this when I was growing up. I wish I would have known this 20 years ago. And I can't wait to tell my daughters about this. This is amazing. I can't wait to teach my daughters about this, this information, and teach them about their bodies and fertility awareness and mucus and all of these things. And so that has been so consistent that about 2 years ago, it's more than 2 years ago, actually. It's nearly 2.5 years ago, I decided that I wanted to write a book. And I embarked on this journey. And, at the time, I really thought, okay, it's going to, I'll be able to write this book in 6 months. I've been talking about this stuff for nearly 20 years. This is going to be easy. But the project just took on a life of its own. So a couple interesting things about the book itself. The book there's 18 chapters in the book. And I'll go through some of the topics that I talk about. So obviously, I talk about the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And one of the things that I become very passionate about, and I think I was always passionate about this, but one of the things that I'm very passionate about, especially as a podcaster, is over the years, I've had just the amazing blessing and opportunity to interview so many amazing experts in the field of fertility. And I've had the opportunity to review, their books, and then have them on the show and be able to basically pick their brains and ask them all the questions that I want to ask after reading their book. And so what I found is that, there's a lot of books out there, and some books really go into depth with the knowledge and information. So you don't necessarily have to take the author's word for it. You can actually read and research and look into these things further. And I'm like a hyper data nerd. So I'm the type of person who's going to read a book and actually, if I see something really interesting, I'm actually going to find the reference and read it and learn more about it. Cause that's the type of person that I am. And so then when it came to writing my own book, it was really important to me that I wasn't just, blowing hot air into the world. I mean, I've got the podcast for that. No, just kidding. That was a joke. I'm not blowing hot air into the world with the podcast. But in a sense, I mean, I just really wanted the book to be more than an opinion piece, because we don't need another one of those in the world. There's enough of those. So what was really important to me was, even though there's a lot that I know, I made a point of researching the heck out of this book so that anybody who reads it doesn't have to take my word for it on anything that I say. And I back up what I say with the scientific references. And that is why this book didn't take 6 months to write, because it takes a long time to actually go through and read thousands of research papers and, highlight all the points and then, choose what is most relevant and boil it down in a way that is understandable and relatable and readable for everybody. And I mean, I have a knack for that. I've been teaching women for years. I've had a number of, when I was reflecting on this, I realized that I've had a number of jobs where, my job was literally to stand up in front of people and talk about specific topics. And when you are in a situation where you're educating others, over the years, especially, I've been teaching fertility awareness for so long and doing presentations, working with women directly and all of that kind of, those types of things. I mean, you end up having to explain a lot of really complicated stuff in easy terms. And I mean, that's what I do in my groups. My group program is starting tomorrow. So I've got a new group of women that are going to be jumping into my 10-week fertility awareness mastery program tomorrow. And it's the same idea. I get a lot of questions, and my job is essentially to find ways to explain this really complicated sciencey data in a really easy way for everyone to understand. And so that took time. That definitely took time. It took more time than I thought, but it was worth it because that was my vision. My vision was not to just have another person's opinion in the world, but to provide you, the Fertility Friday community, with a solid resource that actually you can then go and have access to all this data. One of the things that I found being part of the fertility awareness community for so long is that there's a lot of really amazing information that is really kind of walled up within our community that isn't necessarily as easily accessible to everybody else. There is just amazing, fascinating research about cervical mucus. It just goes on and on and on. Cervical mucus has so many amazing functions. And so just to share a few things about it, which some we've talked about on the podcast already, but for example, cervical mucus is the primary sign of fertility that you're going to want to pay attention to, whether you're avoiding pregnancy or whether you're trying to get pregnant. And the reason for that is there's a few. One is that cervical mucus can keep sperm alive for up to 5 days, which many of you knew already. But cervical mucus also plays a crucial role in fertility. Cervical mucus, in keeping the sperm alive, it nourishes the sperm. It also rapidly transports the sperm into your cervical crypts, where they wait until, ovulation to be released into your uterus. I know it sounds kind of like a movie or something, but that's really what happens. It's really interesting. And in addition to that, your cervical mucus actually prepares sperm through a process called capacitation, meaning our cervical mucus actually causes the sperm to undergo chemical, physiological changes that then allow that sperm to go on to fertilize an egg. And until the sperm passes through your mucus and swims through it, it's actually not capable of fertilizing anything. And in addition to that, cervical mucus screens, malformed sperm. And the majority of sperm that men produce are abnormal. That's like a fact. Even in men with super healthy sperm, the majority of the sperm that men produce are abnormal. So our cervical mucus actually has a screening capacity to actually filter out defective and abnormal sperm. That, ladies, is the tip of the iceberg. And this is, again, not off the top of my head. There's years and years of scientific research about cervical mucus that illustrates these qualities. And so I have an entire chapter on cervical mucus, and it was so much fun to write. It was actually one of the more challenging chapters to write for some reason. I feel like the cervical mucus chapter ended up being harder to write, but it was because I was trying to fit in so much information in a way that makes sense. And I realized that when I talk, it's a lot easier to explain things. So you have to really take time to craft your words on the page so that they can help you as the reader to really go through and understand it. Of course, there's lots of pictures because I'm very visual. Anyone who's listening who has worked with me one-on-one knows that I'm always pulling up pictures and diagrams and using my hands and all kinds of stuff because I'm a teacher, really. And I like to, and I think that's how I learn as well. I learn through pictures, and I always visualize and picture things in my mind. So I tried to recreate that experience for you. But the cervical mucus, that's just an example of an area where there's a ton of fascinating research that really does apply to the average woman. I think it is really helpful for us to know how our bodies function to the degree to know how our cervical fluid helps our fertility and how it's related to our fertility. There's so many women out there currently trying to conceive and having difficulty with it. within my Facebook group, within my group programs, I'm constantly in contact with women who are trying to conceive. And having this level of detail and understanding about your body and your fertility and how to identify when in your cycle is fertile and the specific role that cervical mucus plays in fertility, in pregnancy, in conception, those pieces of information are really crucial. They're very practical. And again, it's not rocket science. Like, there's a lot of specific nuances to it, but really we can handle it. And we also have the right to know about it. And it can really make a difference in how we approach our fertility, or how we approach trying to conceive, or the different things that we're doing. And so my goal with the book was, not just to talk about cervical mucus, but definitely it was super fun to write that chapter and to really go into that type of depth, because I know that you want to hear about it. I know that you're going to appreciate that. I've already had a few of my advanced readers tell me that was their favorite chapter, because really it's just super interesting and super fascinating. But one of the consistent comments that I've had over the years about the podcast is that it's like the podcast provides hard to find information all in one place. And so another lofty, ambitious goal of mine was to create like a physical resource that reflected basically the journey of Fertility Friday over the years. So, a significant part of the book is about fertility awareness specifically, of course, because that's the core of everything that I do with Fertility Friday. And so there's several chapters that outline what it is, what the research says about it, how do you actually go about it, specific things to know when you're avoiding pregnancy, what the rules are, how to manage your fertile window, and specific things to do when you're trying to conceive. And that part of it may surprise you into how much depth I went into in terms of pregnancy planning. And also, I didn't just focus on women. One of the things that I've really, and I think I said this in my anniversary episode that I released towards the end of December, which is one of my takeaways from basically, all the years, but one of my takeaways more so from last year was how important it is to focus on sperm quality as well. And so there's a lot of specific information in the book about how to optimize, if you're trying to conceive, how to use fertility awareness to optimize your chances when you know that you have poor sperm quality, but also how to improve sperm quality specifically. And there's a lot of different things. So we'll do another episode about that, because that's an entire episode. But I just want to share, there's a lot of topics that I cover in this book. And essentially, these are the topics, these are the things that are important to the women who I work with. These are the things that we spend our time talking about in the group programs. These are the specific challenges that we face as women. So we face the challenge of having reliable birth control. For women who are using fertility awareness, you face the challenge of trying to figure out how to do it and how to do it effectively and confidently. So from understanding your mucus observations and really, sticking with it, staying consistent with your charting, to, interpreting your basal body temperature and cervical position. But really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So then it really spills over after you've kind of gone through the initial phases of charting to, well, what the heck is going on my chart? What does it mean if I have a short luteal phase or delayed ovulation, and what are the implications about my health, and what can I do to improve that? So as you can tell, it was a very ambitious project, but I was up for the challenge, and I really enjoyed writing it. I really enjoyed researching for it. It was really fascinating to me to see some of the research. So I'm going to actually take a moment to read a little bit from the first chapter, talk a little bit about the fifth vital sign aspect, and then also I want to share some of the really interesting tidbits of research that I found as I was researching for the book. I'll just read a little bit from the first chapter, because I think that'll be kind of fun, and then we can talk about the fifth vital sign. Has anyone ever told you that your menstrual cycle is a vital sign, just like your heart rate, body temperature, respiratory rate, and blood pressure? Your menstrual cycle is such a central part of who you are that if your body isn't functioning normally, neither will your cycle. Ovulation is well recognized for its role in reproduction. However, since regular ovulation is only possible when your endocrine system and reproductive system are functioning normally, an irregular or abnormal cycle is an early warning sign of an underlying health problem. So that is how I start the book, essentially. I start the book with the concept of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and really going into some of the myths about the menstrual cycle. In the book, I talk about the myth of the 28-day cycle, the myth of the day 14 ovulation. But beyond that, I actually scoured the research to find what it has to say, what studies have actually looked at women's menstrual cycles and, analyzed them and given us an average. When do women typically ovulate in the menstrual cycle? For where are the research studies? And in those studies, when they actually look at women, when do they ovulate in the cycle? And so it's really, really interesting because although the average cycle falls somewhere between about 27 and 29 days, the normal range for the menstrual cycle falls somewhere between 24 and 35 days. Although the average ovulation happens on about day 15 of the cycle, the range of ovulation in a healthy cycle happens anywhere from day 10 to day 23. And just today, actually, I had a really interesting comment in my Facebook community, the Fertility Friday Facebook community, fertilityfriday.com/community. And one of the women was trying to conceive, and she was timing sex specifically based on the 28-day cycle. So she was timing sex based on day 14 ovulation, even though at some point she realized that she ovulated on day 8 or something, or day 10, but either way, she was ovulating earlier in her cycle. And this is why, that is just such a great example of why, as women, we need to understand, we have to be taught, we have a right to know how our bodies work and how our cycles work, because we're not machines. And if you know from the get-go that there's a range of what's normal, and, having a cycle that ranges somewhere between 24 and 35 days, when we look at the whole cycle with all of the cycle parameters from, your period, how long is it, what the quality of it is, to when you're ovulating in the cycle, to what your cervical mucus patterns look like, to how long your post-ovulatory phases, when we look at all the different parts of the cycle, there's a lot of women out there that have really healthy 32, 33, 34-day cycles. And there are women out there that have 28-day cycles that aren't that healthy because your cycle is about more than its length. And so, for instance, in this woman's case, who was posting in the Facebook group, believing that myth that all women always ovulate on day 14 and actually taking action based on that, so timing sex specifically based on that date, in her case, because she tended towards ovulating a bit earlier in her cycle, could have actually been actively preventing her from conceiving. So unbeknownst to her, she might have been using fertility awareness to avoid pregnancy just based on that simple piece of misinformation. So one of the things I say in the book is that these myths are actually harmful. It's not like they're not harmful. And they're harmful both for women who are trying to avoid pregnancy and women who are trying to conceive. Because there's a certain percentage of women out there who are trying to conceive who are consistently timing that date wrong because they're timing based on a date and not based on their bodily signs. And for some women, just switching that up and getting the timing right is going to help them to conceive. And especially with, fertility challenges on the rise and more couples struggling to get pregnant, we really don't need to essentially waste any time timing things incorrectly based on a misunderstanding. But, it's not just me and other fertility awareness educators that are talking about the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. So in addition to the very practical aspects of demystifying the menstrual cycle and learning what's normal and identifying what a healthy cycle looks like and what's typical, kind of getting out of that idea that all cycles are 28 days and ovulation always happens on day 14, there's an additional aspect to it because there is a limit to what we can consider normal. So, 35 days, once we start getting beyond that, or once we start seeing patterns of cycle irregularities, delayed ovulation or irregular ovulation or anovulation, then the concept of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign really comes into play. Because if you have a woman who is really only having, 6 or 7 periods a year and her cycles range from, 40 days to 60 days or something like that. So she's going months between having a period because she's not ovulating regularly and her ovulation is delayed. In her case, and in any woman's case who's experiencing those type of cycle irregularities, that is a sign that there's a deeper issue going on. So we might think that the issue is actually her ovulation. But what we're seeing with regards to her cycle irregularities and kind of problematic presentation of her menstrual cycle is really a symptom of an underlying health issue that when corrected the cycle, will go back to normal. And we may think, oh, it's just, a regular period or something like that. But for instance, women who have irregular cycles, so women who are still ovulating, but the ovulation happens more sporadically, are at a much higher risk for a lot of different cardiovascular risk factors, including the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, including the risk for heart disease and different types of specific cardiovascular risk factors. So, when we have a woman who has irregular cycles, the current paradigm, our current health paradigm, involves putting her on hormonal birth control to make her bleed every 28 days. And then we can all feel better. She's bleeding every 28 days. But it doesn't address any of the underlying factors. It certainly doesn't cure or fix the actual issue. And then at some point, when she decides she wants to come off hormones and maybe, try for a baby, the cycles were never fixed. So then she's left with an even bigger problem because the problem just keeps getting worse in the background when you're not addressing it. So, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Really recognizing that, there is such a thing as a normal menstrual cycle. And the vital sign analogy is really, really helpful because the most common vital signs are, your blood pressure, your temperature, and your heart rate or your respiratory rate. So if you were to go into your doctor's office, we all know that there's an established set of normal parameters when it comes to your vital signs. And if your temperature is really high, or if your blood pressure is too high or too low, or if your respiration rate is way off base, then the doctor will immediately know based on that vital sign that there's something wrong. And also have a sense of where to look for the answer. So, if your temperature is really high, that's typically, if you're running a fever, that's typically a sign of an infection or something like that. And that can be something that really saves a person's life because if they have this fever, the doctors know, okay, we have to figure out what is going on here. We have to know the source of this infection, what's causing this person to have the fever. And in the very same way, you have the menstrual cycle and there's an established set of normal parameters for the menstrual cycle. And what's interesting as well about vital signs kind of across the board is that they're also giving you a real-time measure. So the fever isn't telling you something about last week. It's actually telling you right now that you have a fever. So there's something going on right now. And then the same way with the menstrual cycle, if there's something going on in your body right now, you're going to see some of these disruptions. So it's this very interesting additional sign that we have as women that we can really pay attention to and that we really need to pay attention to because our medical system doesn't always pay attention to it. And so, for instance, in the case of irregular periods, as we talked about, often very common in the case of polycystic ovary syndrome, a classic polycystic ovary syndrome chart would involve delayed ovulation and more sporadic ovulation. So women having their periods kind of not regularly. And that's associated with, as I mentioned, cardiovascular risk factors, increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, inflammation, metabolic disturbances. And these are all extremely serious health issues that need to be addressed instead of just having this woman go on hormonal birth control. Hypothalamic amenorrhea is also an excellent example of, how the menstrual cycle can be this early warning sign of a bigger problem. Because if you have a woman who stops ovulating altogether and basically stops getting her period, that's a huge problem. And so, I talk about HA in the book, and we've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast. And I feel like HA is such a great example of how the menstrual cycle can be looked at as a vital sign. And one of the reasons for that is if a woman loses her period, so she stops menstruating, and so, she's not menstruating, and it's not because she's on some sort of hormone. She just is not menstruating. One of the side effects of amenorrhea, which is, the word for not having a period, is an increased risk of osteoporosis and significantly increased rate of bone loss. Women who stop menstruating rapidly lose bone mass. And depending on how long this situation lasts, it is not always reversible. And so that leads to an increased risk of developing osteoporosis. Now, for anyone who ever thought that your period is kind of like inconsequential, doesn't really make a difference, whatever, it is. That's when you think about it that way, all of a sudden it really clicks in like, wow. And so, when you're in the case of HA, when a woman stops menstruating, there's a lot of specific factors that are at play. Again, the period stopping is a sign of an underlying issue. And so I've recorded 2 separate interviews with Dr. Nicola Rinaldi, PhD, author of the book No Period, Now What? And what's interesting is that HA has certain characteristics. Women develop HA when they basically are in a chronic state of energetic deficiency, and that can be related to undereating. It can be related to excessive weight loss. It can be related to excessive overexercise. It can be related to significant stress and or a combination of all 3. And so essentially, what I always say is that your body can't speak to you with words. And so because your body can't not tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, Lisa, you need to eat more and you really need to sleep more and you're just under way too much stress. Your body can't communicate that way. So, your body communicates with you in different ways. And if you don't listen, to the subtle cues, eventually the cues become a lot stronger. And so charting your menstrual cycles then and getting a sense of what's normal for you is helpful. Establishing a baseline, and then you have that information. You know what your cycles are typically like. You know what it typically seems like and looks like when you're approaching ovulation. You know about when ovulation typically takes place in your cycle, what your post-ovulatory phase is typically like. If you were to ever notice a significant shift or something like that, then you would be alerted right away that there could be an underlying issue. And that is how essential your cycles can be. I think that one of the inspirations for writing this book as well is that whenever I'm working with women, it's like this amazing gift when you can actually read your cycles and kind of gauge different things that you wouldn't have thought would be related to your periods. And so, many of my clients discover that, whether it's kind of the usual offenders like coffee and alcohol or something like that, to see how it affects their cycles. For some women, it really affects them right away. For other women, it's a little bit different. Every woman doesn't respond the same way to everything. For other women, it's like food sensitivities, and they had no idea that it affected their cycles. For some women, it's stress. And just to actually see how both acute and chronic stress can impact the cycle is really fascinating. For some women, it's endocrine issues. So thyroid disorders, adrenal fatigue, just all these different types of things. For some women, it's really kind of jarring to them to find out wow, my cycle really does shift in response to these different types of things. And it just goes on and on and on. And so that's the central message of the book, to really connect us to our menstrual cycle and recognizing that it's a vital sign. And one of the chapters that I had, the most fun writing, that also took probably, I don't know if it took the longest. I would have to really think hard about which chapter took the longest to write, but it certainly was up there, is I have 2 chapters specifically about the pill. And it was funny. One of my advanced reviewers, I think her comment, I'm not recalling it exactly because I'm not reading it, but she said something to the effect of, she's like, I listened to your podcast and often you say on air that you're going to stop yourself from ranting. And she's like, I felt like in the book, you actually went through and actually talked it all through, basically went through all the points. Because, I find myself talking about the pill a lot, and I do often stop myself from ranting about it because it's a bit of it's an interesting topic. It's a big topic. It's a big topic because the pill plays this central role in the women's movement. And there's a lot of women. I remember one of my first boyfriends, I had this conversation with him and his mom, because his mom was right in there in the women's movement. So, I was literally saying this stuff when I was in my early 20s. But I remember having this conversation because for her, the pill really meant, for her was it signified women's liberation. So to have this 21-year-old or 20-year-old girl saying no, the pill suppresses your hormones and it's not good for you and blah, blah, blah. She was really taken aback by that and adamantly opposed what I was saying. And so it's a very interesting conversation to be in because we all have a lot of different opinions about the pill. And so I'll try to share my opinion concisely-ish. The pill, I think that we don't want to ignore the significance of the pill in the women's movement. There's a lot of women for whom before the pill was fully kind of established in our current world. So when I was researching for the book, I actually researched about when the pill was first developed and the individuals who were responsible for bringing it to market. And so the fathers of the pill were Gregory Pincus and John Rock. And it's really interesting to kind of see how this whole process came about. So in the book that I was reading, as I was writing that part of the pill chapter, they were talking about basically this whole other time. This is like the 40s and the 50s. And this is a time before women had access to birth control, and also at a time when women didn't necessarily have a lot of agency in their relationships. At least not all women had the agency to be able to define how many children they want. I was actually talking to one of my mom's friends, and my mom is, definitely of an older generation, and her friend as well. And the reason I say that is because I'm talking to, my mom's friend. So this woman's a grandmother already. She's, I don't know exactly how old she is, probably in her 70s, West Indian woman. And I was talking about like, I think I had just had my first son. I think, so my first son was like a baby, really, really, really little. And I think I was saying something like, yeah, I think we might have another one. And, just talking about my ability to communicate with my partner and decide how many kids we were going to have. And she said something that really floored me. She was like, well, because it was a really interesting conversation to me. She was like, I never was really into having children, is what she said. But she had 4. She had 4 children. So back in that time, like she wasn't really into having kids, and she had 4 of them. So that was, even though she didn't want it. And she was like, back in those times, she's like, I couldn't really go to my husband and be like, I didn't want to have any more kids. That's what she said. And that's just one person's experience. But the reason I share that and the reason it came to mind is because when I was reading that book and kind of researching for that chapter, one of the things that they said was that, these doctors they would have women coming into their office and they would be on their like 8th child by the age of 30. And really the only solution that these doctors had for these women who were basically saying like, I don't want any more kids. What can you do for me, doctor? The only solution that the doctors were able to offer at that time was a hysterectomy. And I thought that was just like, it's just hard to imagine as a woman who grew up in, the 80s and 90s. And it's hard to imagine that being the reality. And it's also hard to imagine kind of the social dynamics back then, especially pertaining to my mom's friend, where she didn't really feel like she had the ability to communicate to her partner in such a way to say, I didn't want that many kids, or, to plan out how many kids you're going to have, which is something I take for granted today. So that was like a long tangent, but I thought that was really interesting. So when it comes to like the pill itself and the history of the pill, what is most fascinating about the history of the pill is that when it was first developed, they started testing it on women. And not all the women that they were testing on, like some of the women that they were testing on wanted to get pregnant. Like many drugs, when it first came, like when they were first kind of developing this and figuring out the formulation, it kind of started as one thing and turned into another. So there was a certain degree of like, if we give these synthetic hormones, maybe it'll kickstart the cycle and some of these women who can't get pregnant will get pregnant. So what happened was they gave these women the pill, and this is in the late 50s, when they were testing, because the pill first came to market in 1960. And their period stopped altogether. And so what happened was, because there was no precedent for this, it's not like today where we all know about the pill. These women, there was no pill back then. So these women quickly became convinced that they were pregnant. So just imagine, you had all these women completely convinced that they were pregnant because they were taking this medication, and the doctors would try to explain to them like, no, you're not pregnant. It's this pill that's preventing you from having your period. But the women couldn't, there was no precedent for this. They could not get it in their heads that they weren't pregnant. And so when they figured out that they weren't pregnant, they would be devastated. And you could just imagine having never experienced any type of hormonal change to the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle just happened. Until this point, you would just get your period. There was no way to stop it. And that was your, sign every month that you weren't pregnant. And there was no, that's all it meant, right? There was no one who just didn't, if you didn't menstruate back then, it was you literally, there was a medical issue, or you were pregnant or breastfeeding or something like that. Or yeah. So then what happened was, at the very outset of this pill design, the makers of the pill discovered that, if you just give a couple sugar pills towards the end of what would have been the cycle, then the women will have a bleed and then they'll know that they're not pregnant. So they actually took the feedback from the beta testers of the pill and created a design of the pill that mimicked the menstrual cycle so that the women would go along with it. And these women weren't told that they weren't actually menstruating, it's very much to this day, we still aren't told that we're not menstruating, that it's not your period, that your cycles are basically not happening. And then when you take the fake hormones away for a while, your body responds by bleeding, which is called a withdrawal bleed. Even from its inception, the women were lied to from the very beginning. And so, when you think about the pill's role in the feminist movement and how it's not so kosher to talk critically about the pill, I think it's really important to look at the history and to think about that for a moment. I mean, even the very first women who used the pill didn't know how it worked. And that conversation and that lack of information and knowledge persists to this day because women continue to be told that, the pill regulates your cycle. Oh, if you're not getting a period every 28 days or something like that, if you don't know when your next one is coming, the doctors put you on the pill to regulate the cycle, but they don't tell you that the pill takes away your cycle and replaces it with a fake, synthetic cycle. And of course, the makers of the pill, they could have chose any formulation of days. They could have had the women bleed every 40 days, but they specifically chose the 28-day cycle so that the women would think they were still having one. So that's just a part of it, right? That's literally the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the pill. But I really, it's just my curiosity. I was really fascinated to look into how the pill came to being and how we basically got, 3 generations of women to go along with this. And really, they pulled the wool over our eyes. And when the pill first came out in the 1960s, they never tested it on women for 20 years. That wasn't a thing. And so I don't believe that the pill was ever intended for long-term use. It really, that was not what the design was for. So although the relationship between the pill and the feminist movement is complex, I think that it's really important to be able to speak openly about it. And so to clarify my point, as I always do, I don't believe that no one should ever use the pill. I mean, we haven't even talked about the side effects in this particular episode. I've done a number of podcast episodes where we go into it. So I don't believe that it's no one should ever use it. But my whole thing has always been from day one that we really deserve to have informed consent. And so this isn't about saying no one should ever use it, but if you've ever tuned into my pill reality series, so that's fertilityfriday.com/pill reality, I've interviewed a number of women over the years, and many of these women's stories made it into the book, which is it just really contextualizes the conversation about the pill and the side effects. But in those conversations with women where they describe their experiences, their emotions, the different changes that they went through when they were on hormonal birth control, the common thread that I have taken from those conversations is that virtually none of those women were ever told specifically by their practitioners that they could experience the side effects that they experienced. From recurrent yeast infections to headaches to depression to low libido to painful sex to nutrient deficiencies to anxiety attacks, on and on and on and on, or panic or anxiety attacks. But on and on and on and on, those side effects, the consistent thread in the stories of the women who I've spoken to over the years, they were never told that these side effects were related. So they had to experience those side effects. And then through their own research and through their own kind of, many of these women for years were on a quest to figure out what the heck was going on. And they had to kind of figure it out because no one ever told them that the pill could be related to their side effects. And so that's essentially the point. The point is about education. It all comes back to education. So the first thing is that if we can recognize that our menstrual cycles are important and that they're connected to our health and that they're actually a vital sign, that's the first step, because then we can recognize how shutting down the menstrual cycle with hormonal birth control can really have this deeper impact well beyond preventing us from getting pregnant. And then, the next part of that is informed consent. We have the right to know what the side effects are and what to expect. Because if someone just gave us a heads up, like, by the way, when you take this, you want to look out for these things. And if you experience them, you may want to consider just hopping off the pill for a couple months to see if they get better. Because I wouldn't want you to feel depressed and anxious and have no libido and painful sex and, start thinking that it was you and there was something wrong with you. But of course, that's not typically what happens. Although some women do have a really positive experience. And I have spoken to women who've gone into their doctor's office and their doctors actually pull out the inserts of these hormonal birth control methods and have the women read it there. So that is not the norm, but I certainly have spoken to women who have had positive experiences with their practitioners. So, that gives you just a little tidbit of just the breadth and depth of information. So some interesting things, I'll have to wrap this up at some point because I could obviously talk about this forever. But a couple of really interesting studies that I came across. One of the things that really surprised me was how much information there is about how the pill affects mate choice. And so for those of you who have heard about that, many of you have heard that there's, research out there that shows that if you're on hormonal birth control, you might actually choose a different partner than you would if you weren't on hormonal birth control. And what I thought was super interesting, I was like, okay, let me just do a little bit of research and see if I can find anything. And I found so much research. It was like no ends of research in the field of environmental biology, where they're really looking at the pheromones and how different hormones can change how you smell and change how your partner perceives your scent and can actually alter the type of partner that you're going to choose depending on if you're using hormonal birth control. So hormonal, I'm going to say HCs, hormonal contraceptive, because I can barely pronounce hormonal and I keep saying it funny. But so HCs, what the research shows is that when you're on them, so when you're on hormones that disrupt your normal endocrine system and your normal menstrual cycle, you're more likely to choose a partner that is more genetically similar to you. And controversy upon controversy, I'm going to say it because it's what the research shows, even though it is a controversial thing to say. The research also shows that for women who are on birth control, if they are, they did these studies where they had these women pick out like male partners based on, and like talk about different features. So they just had this whole thing where they would select men and they would, so it's very gendered because it's environmental biology. But anyways, what the research shows is that women who are on HCs, hormonal contraceptives, are more likely to choose a partner who is a male partner who has more feminine characteristics and is more genetically similar. And then there's all these like very controversial implications of that. And so what I say in the book is that the truth is stranger than fiction. Like you can't make this stuff up because it just seems so wild. Like, wow. So not only have we kind of heard about it on the fringes, but there's actually a ton of research to kind of back it up. And you can actually look into it and see what the research has to say about the specific ways that hormonal birth control impacts our, even the type of partner we would choose. And so, I did an interview on the podcast with one of the women who I highlight in the book who had an experience where she went off birth control and she really couldn't stand the way her partner smelled anymore, even though she really cared for her partner and she thought he was a great person and everything. But there was just something that happened a couple of weeks after she came off of birth control and she ended up breaking off the relationship because of it. So I could certainly talk more. You can tell how fun this process was for me. The research, doing all the research and really getting in there about all these different topics that are so important just for us as women to know about. But what I'm going to do is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about the process and some of the behind the scenes about the book so that you can get a sense of just, what it was all like. So I invite you to go to thefifthvitalsignbook.com And on the website for the book, you can actually download the first chapter of the fifth vital sign. And the first chapter is specifically about the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And so you'll get an incredible peek and window into the book itself. And the book is available on Amazon in ebook format and paper format. So, some of you have probably Googled it already and are looking at the cover. But when I asked my cover designer to design a cover, I basically told him that I wanted the cover to look like a vulva without looking like a vulva. And I think he did a really good job. So take a look, head over to thefifthvitalsignbook.com, do a quick search in Amazon, and you'll find the book. And I really want to hear your thoughts about it. So I'll start a thread in the Fertility Friday Facebook group. And I'm just really excited to share it with you. My intention was to create a really valuable resource backed with scientific evidence so that as women, we can feel more confident about using the fertility awareness method. We can really move away from that history of thinking that it's just the rhythm method and it doesn't work, and not feeling confident when we're trying to talk to our doctor who thinks that it's like completely like not a method and all of that. I think it's really important for us to stand in our power as women and reclaim the right to menstruate. I get that the pill meant something different for the women of the 60s and the 70s, but for the women of the, I don't know what we're calling it now, the 2010s, the 2020s, I don't know, but for the women of the current generation right now, we have a different understanding of health. We have a different understanding of our endocrine system. And we are really starting to understand that by shutting down one aspect of our body, it just causes a plethora of problems in another. And so as a woman, I believe that I should have the right to have a period and to be healthy. And I have the right to have a healthy period. I don't want to have a horrible, painful, ridiculous emotional landslide every month either. I want to have like a healthy period. I want to have healthy cycles, and I have the right as a woman to cycle. I shouldn't have to be medicated just to live in the world and to avoid pregnancy, because there's a lot of harmful side effects that come when you medicate yourself just for birth control. So yeah, there's a bit of a ranty. Maybe I'll save the rest for another time. And so thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode and for sharing with me in my super exciting news. You can just hear the excitement in my voice. It's been a long road. There's a lot more steps to publishing a book than I would have ever thought. And I'm just really happy that I made it, because there were many times that I couldn't see it. I just didn't know if and when this book would come into the world. So I'm just super excited to be able to share it with you. And really, I wrote the book for you. I wrote this book for the Fertility Friday community. You are the women who I have been connecting with for the past 4 years. And I knew I needed to come up with something good for you. I knew that you didn't just want a fluff piece. You didn't just want some hot air from, Lisa from Fertility Friday. And I really wanted to back it up with the science, over 1,000 research citations, so that you can feel really confident about this being a resource for you. And also because I know a lot of you are just as data nerdy as I am. I know by your questions, I know by our interactions, and I know that you just want more. And what I really think is at the kind of the fundamental base of all of that is our desire to be taken seriously. For those of us who want to use the fertility awareness method and who want to heal our cycles naturally in the face of a medical system that just doesn't even think it's possible and just puts us on medication at every step of the way, we just want for someone to take us seriously and to recognize that this is not I am not, doing some sort of random, do-it-yourself project with no scientific basis. We are in a different time now. And what was really reassuring about the process of writing this book is that there is so much science to support the importance of the menstrual cycle, why it's important, how it's related to health. And also, there's so much science to support being able to really support our bodies in natural ways. And so I feel like that is really what I came to. The hard part, though, is getting the science into your doctor's office. So the science is there. It's kind of rest assured. The evidence is there. What's not there is the translation into modern, common medical practice. And, I did find some research about that. And, I think many of us know this, but just to kind of iterate it, what the research tells us is that it typically takes up to 20 years before current scientific kind of breakthroughs and insights are brought into routine medical offices. And so if anything, after reading this book, you'll see that gap between what the current research says about our fertility, about our menstrual cycles, about our health and the connection there, and what is happening when we go to the doctor. So I will wrap it up there. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/240. And I'm excited to chat with you in our Facebook group. And I'm also excited to talk to you again on Friday with more of a behind the scenes of the fifth vital sign, master your cycles and optimize your fertility. So take care. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.